You're listening to episode 225 of The Secular Buddhist. Welcome to The Secular Buddhist. I'm Ted Meissner. The Secular Buddhist is the official podcast of the Secular Buddhist Association, a grassroots-driven effort to answer the needs of secular teaching and practice for contemporary society. The podcast has interviews and roundtable discussions pertaining to engaged Buddhist training and practice, and the SBA website has show notes for each episode along with resource materials. Though the podcast focuses on core practices from a secular viewpoint, more traditional teachings are welcome and openly discussed. Paul Verhaeghen joins us to speak about secular Buddhist ethics. One of the common criticisms us atheists, and sometimes us Buddhists, receive is that we have no morals without a deeply religious conviction to guide us. And yet, many of us secular Buddhists manage to curb our murderous tendencies and fit right in with an unsuspecting public. So how can that possibly be without the lamp of faith to light our way in the darkness? Paul Verhaeghen is professor of psychology at Georgia Tech, researching cognition and brain science and cognitive aging. So sit back, relax, and have a nice tranquility. Our guest today is Paul Verhaeghen. Paul, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, Ted. I'm glad to be here.
I'm so very glad you're with me, and we've had just a wonderful conversation. For those who are listening, one of the great joys that I have in doing this podcast is sometimes it's just the emails back and forth and getting to speak with potential guests, and that's been one of the great joys I've had with Paul in our conversation before starting today. So thank you for that, Paul. And what I'd like you to do, just to get us started, is share a bit about your background and the, I think, very interesting and maybe somewhat fairly uncommon way you may have come to Buddhism and what that route was like.
Yeah, well, actually don't really remember when I started identifying as a Buddhist, I guess, but I have a checkered past. And when I was 17, so I was very young, I entered a Catholic monastery for 2 years. I was a Jesuit for 2 years. I'm from Belgium originally. That's where the accent's from. And one of my great joys there was that you start with an 8-day retreat, and then in the middle you have a 40-day silent retreat, which was always the weeding out process. But I just really, really loved it. Not just we had this, the Jesuits being the Jesuits had this really big, wonderful house near the one forest that's still there in Belgium. So you got to spend a lot of your days wandering around the woods, and I guess it's a form of walking meditation, but also just a couple of hours a day where you're in your mind and in your head and trying to connect to something at that point. I guess I was calling it God. And I think that's kind of the start of my contemplative life. The Jesuits like to call themselves contemplatives in action, which may have something to do with ethics, I guess. And I made the wonderful mistake of falling in love with someone after 2 years, which isn't very compatible with the monastic lifestyle. So I left, and we got married, and I moved to the States. But so somewhere along that process, I guess I kind of kept looking for silence and the kind of getting inside my head and heart. I always love how Asian languages don't make the difference between heart and head or heart and mind. And I don't really remember how I drifted into Buddhism, but I do remember that I think it probably started when I took a trip to China to study Chinese for 6 weeks. And so I got to spend a lot of time in Beijing and a lot of free time on my hands. And so I went the rounds of all the temples that nobody ever goes to. And I just remember for me, it's nothing like supernatural or mystic, I guess, but just iconography, the way the monks and nuns seemed to be. I remember one afternoon just by accident dropping in on a chanting session in a Taoist monastery, which was very, very powerful. When I came back, I just started reading up. I guess I kind of started teaching myself Zen, which is not something you should be doing. And when I came to the States in 97, I kind of started sitting with the local group. I was at Syracuse University at the local Buddhist student group, which was just wonderful. Then after a while, this is too much information, I guess, but my life started falling apart. I wasn't strong enough on the cushion. I guess when you first start, stuff comes up on the cushion, right? And how do you deal with it? And I didn't do very well. So I kind of gave up on sitting for a couple of years. And I came back when my second wife and I had our baby about 6 years ago. We named him Bodhi, so I suppose there was a very big remnant of Buddhism there. And about 2 years, I guess he was about 2 years, I found myself one too many times being a 2-year-old to a 2-year-old. I think it involved orange juice that got splattered all over my cookbooks and the ceiling, and I was the one throwing the orange juice. So I remembered the days when there was more quiet and power and strength and self-assurance in me, and patience especially. And I thought it would be a good thing, not just for me, but for everyone around me, if I tried to regain some of that. So I started meditating again, and I kind of started with kind of a self-help MBCT kind of program by Williams and Penman. And I just got hooked immediately again. And I kind of felt I was on a point of no return. And so after a while, I decided I wanted to go take the precepts, took an airplane and a train to Plum Village and did that there, which was a really wonderful experience. I also decided at that point that I'm an academic. I'm a psychologist. I'm doing research on attention and memory. And so I thought that, given that I live in my head all the time and I like to think and I like to ruminate, I should probably also do something academic with this. So living in the Bible Belt, it's hard to find a Buddhist program here. So I signed up for a master's in Buddhist studies at the University of South Wales, which is exactly in South Wales in England. Which is Peter Harvey's former course. That's done really wonderfully. So I'm in my, I think, second or third year there now, and just loving all of that.
That's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. And you're in Atlanta now at Georgia Tech, is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. And how long have you been there?
I've been in Atlanta for 8 years now.
Okay, so I'm going to digress from our Buddhist topic and say you've been there for Dragon Con. What do you think of that?
It's wonderful. I see it from a distance. We're trying to convince our 6-year-old that he should go to the Stormtrooper parade, but he hasn't. And I tried to convince my wife she should go to the kilt blowing contest, but she hasn't either.
There's always next year. There's always next year. Well, one reason that you and I are talking is that a friend had recommended a paper that recently was published to Taylor and Francis online, that you'd written Good and Well, The Case for Secular Buddhist Ethics. And for folks who are listening, I will be linking to that on this episode page. We're not really going to go into the depths of the paper. We're really going to have an informal conversation about what do we mean by that? Well, how does that work? And what, Paul, for you, what some of the interests and passions are around Buddhist ethics and why a secular Buddhist ethic. So I'm wondering if you first care to share about what made you decide to write a paper about this. What was the initial interest in it in the first place?
Yeah, well, the initial excuse is that this was a term paper for a class on Buddhist ethics. So I really feel like a stupid college student who wrote a term paper that's actually way over his own head, and now I'm being interrogated about it. So I had to reread it to see what was in there. And so I probably plagiarized like crazy because it's not that bad. There is not a lot, I think, about secular Buddhism. I think there's a lot of hidden stuff. But Stephen Batchelor is really the only writer, I think, who's done this in book format. It's probably time somebody did a great or a big edited volume on this or something. I suggest you should be doing this.
Thanks. I will take credit as an editor of something coming soon.
Oh, wonderful.
So, well, soon being, I'm making quotey fingers in the air, soon being relative in like glacier terms or cosmic terms, but eventually, yeah.
And ethics especially seems to be one that people have trouble with, right? And it's not just in Buddhism, it's also in the surrounding Christian culture here, I guess. The idea that there needs to be something like, you could say it as a carrot and a stick, I guess, to keep people being ethical. How can you, from a Christian point of view, be ethical without God or without heaven and hell if you're a Buddhist? Lots of Buddhists, especially, I guess, in Asian cultures, are doing a lot of the stuff they are doing in terms of merit to build up good karma to go towards a better rebirth. And if you don't believe in rebirth and you don't believe in karma as some kind of cosmic retribution that keeps hanging around, then the question is, why would you be ethical? So one of the things I noticed when I started writing this paper is the very strange reactions to Stephen Batchelor's first book, Buddhism Without Beliefs, where I found 3 serious reviews of it that accused him of not talking about ethics. And he actually has a whole chapter in that book called Integrity on ethics. So it's almost as if when a non-secular Buddhist thinks of YOLO Buddhists or single life Buddhists, they don't seem to even see that you could be ethical as a Buddhist. On the other hand, when I have conversations with other friends who are Buddhists and I suppose secular, because we don't necessarily talk about this, I guess, is that there's like, why did you write this paper? What's the problem? Of course, we're ethical and there's other reasons to be ethical. And so I think that was a good impetus for me to try to write this paper, kind of trying to see, can you be an ethical in a Buddhist way if you're a secular Buddhist? And what I found really fascinating is that if you look at some of the recent work on ethics and Buddhism, most of that work actually is completely secular or doesn't even talk about rebirth and karma, but sees ethics in Buddhism as really, as the Buddha also described it in the Four Noble Truths, as part of the path, right action, right speech, right livelihood. So it's not about setting yourself up for a better rebirth. It's really about setting yourself up for your own salvation, for awakening, for liberation, for enlightenment, however you might want to call it, but the liberation of grasping and hatred and ignorance. And that ethics is a very integral part of that.
You know, it's interesting. 2 things come to mind as you're talking about this, that argument, if you don't have X post-mortem belief system, you must have no reason for behaving in a pro-social fashion. Mm-hmm. And that's the same argument that many of us who are atheists have heard for years, for many, many years, before our own births, as a criticism of atheism and secular views, when, frankly, we still manage to not rape, pillage, steal, do all the bad things, and still contribute to charities and do good works. And that's often the example that we bring up to our well-meaning friends, loved ones, family who are concerned for our welfare in whatever fashion that takes. That, you know, we just ask very sincerely, do you think I'm a bad person? And do you notice me doing terrible things? And yet I don't have that belief system. So doesn't that show that you can be ethically in the right side of the tracks without that belief system? Aren't we proof of that? And that always gives a bit of pause. So that it's interesting to hear that is the same argument that we do hear from those who do believe within the Buddhist context, rebirth. And the other aspect of that, and something you'd said was very interesting for me, is that so much newer material is really based on this lifetime stuff. Of course, I think that makes an easy sense because there's you can't bring in a citation example of, well, when I was so-and-so in the previous life, here are the actions that happened. That doesn't go so well in an academic paper. And that the criticisms of Stephen's work seem to have been from a place of ignorance, which is, of course, a poison in the Buddhist tradition. And I'd experienced that just this past weekend as a presenter quote mined and presented what I feel was a false dichotomy between the tradition, which was being held as, a good and right thing, and mindfulness, which was being shown as it was being cast in a negative light as it's associated with, teaching the military, and there was the clear tone and message that was questionable, if not outright bad. And when asked about it afterwards, the presenter had admitted they didn't really read that work. They didn't really know what that program was. And yet they were quoting it as being a bad thing. Again, going into the ignorance. So it just struck me as the same sort of thing with people criticizing Stephen's work, perhaps without even having read it. Then how do you know what's in there to criticize it?
Well, what you just said brought up one of my favorite passages in the Buddhist canon. It's from the Attaka Vagga Sutta, where the Buddha says something like, wise people have opinions and foolish people have opinions too. And one of the things I really like about Buddhism, it's an empirical religion, right? So the Buddha has taught us a few things. This is what you should be doing, what you could be doing. It's more a suggestion, I guess. And when you follow those, you go like, yes, there's something to this. You get small glimpses and you keep going on. And I think in this whole dialogue or conversation that we have from time to time, I guess, between secular Buddhists and non-secular Buddhists, or also between Theravada Buddhists and Mahayana Buddhists and Vajrayana and Soka Gakkai, etc., is that, maybe we don't know enough about each other or don't listen carefully enough to each other. But one of the things I really enjoyed when I was doing this paper is the way Westerners approach the Buddhist tradition is, of course, from the Western point of view, right? Because that's what we have. So I think the interesting discovery by people like Charles Goodman, for instance, or Owen Flanagan, is that you can kind of put Buddhism in what is called meta-ethics. So not the ethics themselves, but the system you have in ethics. And so very often now it's like the classical joke, I guess Christians love Jesus and Buddhists love lists. We have all these rules and we have lists and lists, especially in the Vinaya, the rules for the monastics, that make Buddhism look like a deontology, a list of rules. And it's just, if you want to have a wonderful afternoon, just try to find one or the other version of the Vinaya online. And it's amazing. And it seems like many of those things are done ad hoc. Of course, I guess the 5 precepts that almost every Buddhist takes, then you have the great precept in Zen, don't do harm. Or, of course, not that rule-based, but the Vinaya has all these kind of strange rules. My favorite one is that if you go on an alms round and you get a curry, don't cover it up with white rice. Then you realize that what must have happened was that there was a curry-loving monk who probably was like, hey, I get good curry. Now I go to the next house. Maybe they have curry too. So let me cover up what I have with white rice so they give me more curry. And so there's a rule there, but behind the rule is, well, don't be a glutton, right? Don't take anything that shouldn't belong to you. Also, don't be crafty about it. But also, in a way, to me, and another dimension of this story, of course, is that, sometimes we tend to look up to, the first generation or the first generations of Buddhists as all these amazing arhats who reached enormous potentials of meditation or realized these enormous potentials. But judging from the Vinaya, they were just 6-year-olds, right? Don't make me be a literalist is what that rule says. You're doing this stupid thing. Now I'm going to make a literal rule to not have you do this again.
Yeah, and how interesting it is that was one of the criticisms of Ananda, the Buddha's death, that he neglected to ask, oh my goodness, as his cousin, his dear, dear friend that he had been close to for decades, past that he neglected to ask which rules were the minor ones. And because he didn't do that, oh horrors, we've decided we're going to keep that rule that you just mentioned, along with rules about carrying salt in a horn, because clearly we don't have the discursive thought to realize that those are really kind of not all that important. So we're going to keep all of them, and we'll have 227 formal rules for monks, over 300 for bhikkhunis, and that's carried on for millennia.
And the reason, or we can laugh about this, and I think, well, they tend to take him seriously in monasteries, but not all the time. I've seen Thich Nhat Hanh monks swim, which you shouldn't do for pleasure. I also think they shower more than twice a year. That's another rule, I believe, unless you're dirty. But so Buddhism isn't like that, right? You have these rules, but that's not really what this is about. And some people have argued that it fits better in the Western idea of consequentialism or utilitarianism, that the right thing to do is the thing that brings the most good to the most people. And as Buddhists, I guess we would say to the most sentient beings or even the earth. And that's kind of an interesting idea, but it's really hard to really be a consequentialist. Many people think that that's what secular ethics are based on. I don't know if I should give the standard example in an ethics class is what is called the lorry problem.
Oh, please tell it, because it's always such a fun story to to go through.
Okay, everybody can fast forward now if you know it. But so imagine you're standing on a bridge over a train track that diverges, and so it becomes a Y. So you have the switch, and you're standing on the bridge, and next to you is a person you don't know really very well, and you're, 150 pounds or so, and the person next to you is a little bit heftier, so say about 300 pounds. You see before the branch, when you look over there, you see a lorry come on. It's moving along the track, and you see that there's 5 people or so picnicking on top of the tracks, which isn't very wise, on one of the branches of the Y, and it's the one that the train is going towards. So the train is going to kill those 5 people, and you very quickly realize that you can't jump down and stop the train because, it's just going to run over you. But the person standing next to you is probably just of enough mass if you would chuck that person over the bridge to stop the lorry. The question is, would you throw that person off the bridge, killing the person, but saving the 5 people who are picnicking on the wrong side of the tracks? And most people, when you give them that dilemma, say, of course I wouldn't do this. Now, if we are consequentialists, that's what you should be doing. But most people have something where they say, no, I can't do this, which shows that we're actually not consequentialists. And it would be really nice and interesting to do this study with Buddhists and see if they actually have a different opinion here. What most people say is, I'm not that kind of person. That's the kind of ethics or meta-ethics that's called virtue ethics. That is, or you are interested in being a virtuous person, and you have an idea of what it means to be a virtuous person, and therefore you do the things that a virtuous person should be doing. The interesting part there is that it kind of becomes ingrained. So it's no longer you're sitting there and you're doing the mental calculations about 5 people versus 1 person. And, you can do all kinds of twisted things with that dilemma, right? So imagine that the 5 people who are sitting there are your parents and your spouse and your kids. Then people would be more likely to chuck the 300-pounder over the railing. But still, you're not that kind of person. And so if you look at this in kind of Buddhist terms, you could kind of say, I guess, that we're trying to be virtuous people. That's the virtue ethics of it. But unlike, say, Aristotle's idea of you need to be a rational person, the idea in Buddhism is mostly that you need to be a compassionate person. So the question is not what is the right thing to do. That's the kind of Greek question. But it's more, what is the compassionate thing to do? And in this case, I guess killing somebody isn't a very compassionate deed. So it's unlikely you would probably do this, even in a Buddhist context, or I say even in a Buddhist context, because we often think of Buddhism as dealing with consequentialism. Another really interesting part I found when you read the Buddhist literature is that consequentialism in the West is about what are the consequences of what I do in the real world. And this is an impossible thing, right? You can't really foresee what it is that you're doing and what all the consequences are. In Buddhism, this is solved by the Buddha to place the heavy burden of karma on the intent. So what I want to do, what I want to effect in the real world is this, and therefore this is what I'm trying to do. And you don't need that mental calculation after that. And so to kind of, I guess, take that mental calculation even further out of it, you can look at this as a virtue ethics. Now, the real trick is, how do you get to a virtue ethics? How do you become a person of virtue? I really like that, for instance, Batchelor says one of the things you need to do is practice this. And I guess that is very, very true. What the ground of this is something that you can put outside rebirth and karma totally. You can think of many concepts in different Buddhist traditions, for instance, anatta, not self. If you kind of, after a while, after moments of practicing, long moments of practicing, realize that the boundaries between you and the rest of the world actually aren't as strong as you think they are, that what you think is a you is actually an ongoing process, an unfolding rather than a being, you kind of put less and less emphasis on yourself. For me, in my own personal practice, this is one of the things that I found most amazing. I tend to think of myself as a smart person from time to time, and sometimes you want to show that, and the way this used to show in myself was through snark. I used to be a very snarky person. I don't know if you've ever been in Atlanta, but Atlanta...
For most of my life, that is what I have struggled in, is being that person and realizing the results of that were not so good.
It's not just that the results... You can be very snarky when you're in your car towards all the other drivers and they don't hear it. You really realize, at least for me after a while, and it actually didn't take long, that the person being hurt by the snark is you. Once you start realizing that there's other people there who all want the same thing. We're in rush hour. We all want to get home. We all want to get home unscathed and fine and good. Once you start realizing those things, seeing that we're all victims of dependent origination. There's a cause and an effect in everything we do. We are this way because of this. We are that way because of that. Once you start kind of realizing this through those concepts that are Buddhist, but are not necessarily associated with rebirth and karma. Emptiness is another one, of course. You kind of start building something that in and of itself becomes a way of dealing with other people, not just because it's good for them, but also because at a deeper level, it's really good for you. Being patient with my son isn't just good for my son. It's wonderful for him if I'm more patient, but it's also very good for me. It gives me peace of mind. It opens me up to have wonderful interactions with him and to spend time with him that, is wonderful. And I can see the opportunities to watch him grow. And, rather than saying, hey, you have to be this way, or I want to do this right now. And so it's really in a way, the ethics have a foundation in some of these Buddhist concepts, and the end goal of them is ultimately your own flourishing or your own salvation. And I think that's the realization ultimately that makes secular Buddhist ethics, and some people argue Buddhist ethics in general, really, really work. Now, what I find fascinating on top of that is that there's some psychology involved. I mentioned I was a psychologist, right? One of the people who is often mentioned in this context by people who are interested in secular Buddhist ethics is Derek Parfit, who's a British philosopher, a reductionist who is not Buddhist at all, but writes in some of his works about this. I have a quote here, and he's talking about his own. I like to call it a conversion, even though it's not really that, but his own realization, and this is a rational realization. So it's almost like a Vajrayana thing, I guess, where you kind of do rational exercises to get yourself to compassion, where he started realizing that he doesn't have a determinate identity or a determinate self. So kind of the concept of anatta in Buddhism, that he says, when I still believed in this concept, I seemed imprisoned in myself. My life seemed like a glass tunnel through which I was moving faster every year, and at the end of which there was darkness. When I changed my view, the walls of my glass tunnel disappeared. I now live in the open air. There's still a difference between my life and the lives of other people, but the difference is less. Other people are closer. I'm less concerned about the rest of my own life and more concerned about the lives of others. And so this is a psychological twist here, or psychological switch. And right after that, he mentions that David Hume had the same realization, that now there is no such thing as a fixed self. It's all something that develops and changes. But for Hume, this was very different. And Parfit says Hume was thrown into the most deplorable condition imaginable, environed with the deepest darkness. That's a Hume quote. And so his cure was to dine with his friends and play backgammon. And so the same realization leads one person to something that is, I think, very, very close to the Buddhist idea of compassion and shared humanity, and leads the other person to go into a more hedonistic line of inquiry. And so that kind of fascinates me too, and I have no idea what to do with this empirically, but I guess at one point I'd like to research this, those experiences, those backgrounds in the Dharma seals and kind of discovering them more and more and deeper for yourself seems to not necessarily lead to compassion. So I'm kind of lost there.
The thing that I'm lost by is how backgammon could be considered hedonistic. There are a few other things we could really share that might be a little more hedonistic than backgammon. But I do understand that it is an interesting proposition that two people who have what may, at least on the surface, be a similar realization about not self, maybe more accurate translation around what we consider anatta, and yet come to very different spaces. And I think that really is a fine and great example you're bringing up of the testament for the tremendous complexity and diversity of how every individual engages with a particular idea or realization or practice, that it may manifest in wholly different ways. And that's one thing I wanted to ask your thoughts about, having been just myself at the Center for Mindfulness Spring Conference, where the subject was ethics.
I'm jealous.
And yeah, well, you should be. It was a really, really good, good conference. One of the things that came up as a topic as we were really condensing and cooking the stuff that had been going on for several days was this principle of ethics being a particular conclusionary set of rules, which I don't think anyone there had the thought of them as, versus really being based on lived interconnected values. Mm-hmm. And that out of that arises, and there are several layers that lead up to ethical behavior. I was wondering if that's something that you've had mulling in your mind as well.
Well, I was mentioning earlier that in your practice, and I think that is shared by at least a few other people I've talked to, is that your practice spirals. You return to the same things over and over again, but they are different each time you see them. It is kind of like a wheel. Maybe that's a good metaphor for this, except that the wheel is also moving forward at the same time. And so all these different things interplay. And I like what you mentioned about interconnectedness. It's one that, especially in the Mahayana, I think is really important. When you lower the boundaries of yourself, you also notice more and more that you're interconnected. One of my joys this year was taking the CBCT training that Emory offers here in Atlanta, the cognitively based compassion training. tempted to call it therapy, but it's training, which is based on the Lojong tradition. And so one of the things that they emphasize is it's not the lived experience of not self, but it's a rational exercise to go through. Why do I care more about my well-being than somebody else's well-being? Or why do I care more about my spouse's well-being than the neighbor's well-being? And once you start thinking about this, and the idea is that you do this in meditation, so you do this in focused attention, you start realizing that there is something about that, right? Why am I more concerned when my neighbor is playing the drums than when my wife is playing the cello?
Right.
She's closer by. This is not a fictitious example, but also the web of people and conditions and other sentient beings and things that bring you to where you were. And one of the exercises that for some reason touched me deeply at that moment was to think of something you cherish for yourself, maybe a skill you have or an opportunity you had. Maybe just think about the joy of meditating. What makes this possible? So here I am sitting on a cushion. Somebody made that cushion. The cotton comes from somewhere. The buckwheat hulls come from somewhere. I'm sitting in this house. There's people who built this house. This house is working. And here, because people in Atlanta, there's electricity, there's power. My neighbor makes it possible for me to live in this neighborhood, because if there was nobody else living here, nobody would be living here. The people who visit my grocery store keep the grocery store in business. And so from a simple moment of here I am enjoying this one thing, you kind of have this vast network of things that are connected with this. And ever since that exercise, whenever I walk around the neighborhood, we live in one of those fake new towns. This used to be a brownfield, and they put a shopping center on top of it with housing. So every Friday I used to be terribly upset with all the college kids who come here to drink and watch movies, and not necessarily in that order, and drive too fast. And that's typically the last thing they do. And now it's more like, hey, thank you for being here. That's a stupid example and not a very good one. But you can, of course, go much deeper in this. But we are a network, and we are all interconnected. And that is a deep basis, I think, for compassion. If you want to go non-secular on this, of course, the original Lojong tradition also asks you to consider that every sentient being you encounter in a past life has been your mother and has cared for you, and has brought you to term, has cared for you, brought you up. That's not the case in secular Buddhism, but you can actually look at everything around you and everyone around you and every sentient being around you and see this as contributing to your existence right here, right now.
Right, exactly. Beautifully said. Paul, what else would you like to share with the listeners on this idea of a secular Buddhist ethics? Maybe something we were talking about earlier before we started with the podcast, just what we mean by secular as maybe not being antagonistic or in opposition to the sacred. I'm wondering if you'd care to share some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I do. I'm gathering those thoughts right now, I think. But one of the things I find is that secular Buddhism, in a way, is a negative definition, right? Stephen's book, Buddhism Without Beliefs. But I think a lot more of Buddhism than we sometimes are aware of does not hinge on rebirth and karma. If you can build this whole ethical edifice on something that is clearly in this world and in the material world, the distinction might not be that big. And when I was mentioning those moments of wisdom or moments of insight you get along the path, those can take the form of really deep experiences in meditation or outside of meditation that, when I was back in the Catholic monastery, we would call a unity with the divine or something like that. My guess is that if you're a yogi in the Hindu tradition, you might encounter those same things and call them unity with Brahma or something like that. You can have those same kind of strong, deep experiences, and they tell you something about your mind, about life, about the world, about how things are, about what is and how it is, that is really fundamental. And it doesn't take away from the awe at all, I find. In some ways, it makes it even more awesome because you know that it's there, it's you, and you are the one who's working towards your own salvation and the salvation of others.
And I think that's beautifully put. Paul, is there anything else you'd like to share with the listeners?
Not right now.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for being here, our guest today, Paul Verhaeghen, and I will link to his page at his university so you can take a look at that. Paul, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Thanks for listening. If you'd like to hear more about something you've heard in today's podcast, please come visit the SBA website at secularbuddhism.org, and you'll find an entire webpage devoted to this and every episode. Discussion about this episode can be found on the episode page itself, along with show notes. Sound editing, mixing, and mastering provided by the generosity of Anthony Dominello of StructureFromSound.com. The music for The Secular Buddhist is used by permission from John Kaizen Neptune's CD, Steps in Time. Additional music is provided courtesy of Monty Levinson of Taihei Shakuhachi and Rodrigo Rodriguez. Their websites are linked on the SBA site on the About Podcast Music page. Until next time, remember, every moment you have a choice. Make it the best you can. See you next time on The Secular Buddhist.